The lighthouse was guiding ships to their graves, and the keeper had been dead for 23 years. October 13th, 1954. Detective Frank Morrison drove through the winding coastal roads of Maine, following reports that seemed impossible even by his standards. For 3 weeks, ships approaching Devil's Point Light had been receiving navigation signals that led them directly toward the jagged rocks. But every investigation showed the lighthouse was abandoned, its beacon dark for over 2 decades. The Coast Guard was baffled, local fishermen were terrified, and the townspeople of Beacon's End whispered about old Ezra Whitmore, the lighthouse keeper who had vanished during the Great Storm of 1931. They said his ghost still tended the light, but now he was guiding vessels to destruction instead of safety. Morrison had come to Maine to investigate insurance fraud. 3 ships had been wrecked near Devil's Point in the past month, all claiming they were following legitimate lighthouse signals. But as his car rounded the final bend and Devil's Point Light came into view, Morrison realized he wasn't dealing with insurance fraud. He was facing something far more sinister. Before we uncover the truth behind the ghost of Devil's Point Light, I need to know, have you ever had an experience you simply can't explain? Something you saw, heard, or felt that defies all logic? Tell your story in the comments below. It could be a mysterious figure, an impossible coincidence, or that moment when you knew something supernatural was happening. Your experiences may inspire future investigations by Detective Morrison. And don't forget to leave a like if you dare to discover what really happened at that cursed lighthouse in the fall of 1954.
Beacon's End, Maine, was the kind of coastal town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and secrets were as rare as calm seas in October. Population 847, most of them dependent on fishing or the seasonal tourist trade that dried up after Labor Day. But in the autumn of 1954, the town was harboring a secret that was literally killing people. Morrison's first stop was Murphy's Tavern, a weathered establishment where the local fishermen gathered to share news and strong coffee. The moment he walked in, conversations stopped. Strangers weren't common in Beacon's End during October, and a big city detective asking questions about Devil's Point Light made everyone nervous. But Morrison had ways of getting people to talk. He ordered a coffee, mentioned he was investigating insurance claims, and waited. Eventually, an old fisherman named Captain Jeremiah Morse approached his table. Morse had been working these waters for 40 years, and his weathered face told stories of countless storms survived. "You're here about the light, ain't you?" Morse said without preamble. "About them ships getting wrecked where no ship should be getting wrecked." Morrison nodded, and Morse continued. "Devil's Point Light went dark in 1931, when Ezra Whitmore disappeared during the Great Storm. Coast Guard searched for weeks, never found his body. Lighthouse has been abandoned ever since." But then Morse leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Thing is, Detective, that light ain't been dark, not really. Every few years someone sees it burning in the night, red light instead of white. And when ships follow that red light," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Morrison learned that Ezra Whitmore had been the lighthouse keeper for 18 years before his disappearance, a solitary man who took his responsibility seriously, perhaps too seriously. Whitmore had never married, had no family, and rarely came to town except for supplies. His entire world was that lighthouse and the ships he guided safely through the treacherous waters around Devil's Point. The Great Storm of 1931 had been the worst in living memory. Winds over 90 miles per hour, waves tall as 3-story buildings, and visibility near zero. 3 ships had been caught in the storm that night, all desperately needing guidance to safety. When the storm cleared, all 3 ships had made it to harbor, but EZRA Whitmore was gone. The lighthouse had been found with its light still burning, the lens mechanism still rotating, but Whitmore was nowhere to be found. His logbook showed entries right up until midnight, noting the positions of the 3 ships he was guiding. The final entry, written in his careful handwriting, simply said, "All souls must reach safe harbor."
Morrison decided to examine Devil's Point Light himself. The lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory about 2 miles from town, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound between jagged rocks and tide pools. As he approached, Morrison could see why the location had earned its ominous name. The point jutted into the Atlantic like a devil's pitchfork, with razor-sharp rocks hidden just beneath the surface. The lighthouse itself was a classic Maine structure, 42 feet tall, white-painted brick with a red roof, built in 1847 to guide ships through the treacherous passage between Devil's Point and Seal Island. Morrison noted that despite 23 years of abandonment, the structure appeared remarkably well maintained. The front door was locked, but Morrison's investigative experience included certain skills not taught in police academy. Inside, he found the lighthouse exactly as it had been left in 1931. Whitmore's personal belongings were still there, his clothes hanging in a wardrobe, books stacked neatly on shelves, even a half-finished meal on the kitchen table. But it was the lighthouse keeper's quarters that revealed the first real clue. Morrison found Whitmore's collection of maritime maps, each one marked with precise notations of ship positions, weather patterns, and safe navigation routes. These weren't just work documents, they were the obsessive records of a man who tracked every vessel that passed his light. In a locked desk drawer, picked by Morrison with the same skills that had opened the front door, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Whitmore had been keeping detailed records of ship movements not just in 1931, but continuing right up through 1954. The most recent entry was dated 3 days ago. The handwriting was identical to the 1931 entries. Same ink, same paper, same careful script. Either someone was maintaining an elaborate hoax using Whitmore's exact writing style, or the lighthouse keeper who had vanished 23 years ago was still somehow keeping his records. Morrison climbed the narrow spiral staircase to the lighthouse's beacon room. Each step echoed in the confined space, and he could feel the structure swaying slightly in the ocean wind. But as he reached the top, Morrison discovered something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the case. The lighthouse beacon was not only functional, it was actively maintained. The lens was clean, the mechanism oiled, and the bulbs were modern replacements, not the original 1931 equipment. Someone had been caring for this lighthouse, keeping it ready for operation. But more disturbing was what Morrison found when he examined the lighthouse's logbook more carefully. According to Whitmore's records, he had indeed been guiding ships safely through Devil's Point for the past 23 years. But every ship he listed as safely guided corresponded to a vessel that had actually been wrecked on the rocks below. Morrison realized the horrible truth. Someone was using EZRA Whitmore's identity and obsession to lure ships to destruction. The red light that fishermen reported wasn't a supernatural phenomenon. It was a deliberately deceptive signal designed to cause wrecks, not prevent them. But as Morrison examined the beacon mechanism more closely, he heard something that made his detective instincts flare with alarm. Footsteps on the rocks below. Someone was approaching the lighthouse, and Morrison was trapped at the top of a 42-foot tower with only one way down. Through the beacon room windows, Morrison could see a figure climbing the rocky trail toward the lighthouse. The person moved with familiarity, knowing exactly where to step to avoid the loose rocks and hidden tide pools. This wasn't a casual visitor. This was someone who came here regularly. Morrison had two choices: confront whoever was approaching, or hide and observe. His detective instincts told him to gather information first. He concealed himself behind the beacon mechanism and waited, his hand resting on his service revolver. The lighthouse door opened with the squeal of hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. Morrison heard familiar movements below, someone who knew exactly where everything was located, moving through the lighthouse as if they had lived there for years. As the footsteps began climbing the spiral staircase, Morrison could hear humming, an old sea shanty that fishermen sang during long voyages. The tune was melancholy but determined, the kind of song that kept sailors company during lonely watches. When the figure finally reached the beacon room, Morrison found himself face to face with a man who should have been impossible. The person standing before him matched every description of Ezra Whitmore: tall, weather-beaten, wearing the same style of keeper's uniform that had been standard in 1931. But Morrison's trained eye caught details that revealed the truth. This man's hands were too smooth for someone who had spent decades maintaining a lighthouse. His uniform, while authentic in style, was made with modern fabrics. And most tellingly, his teeth showed the kind of dental work that hadn't been available in 1931. "You're not Ezra Whitmore," Morrison said, stepping out from behind the beacon mechanism with his badge displayed. The fake keeper showed no surprise at being discovered. Instead, he smiled with genuine warmth. "No, Detective Morrison, I'm not," the man replied. "My name is Thomas Whitmore. Ezra was my uncle, and before you ask how I knew you were here, I've been watching the town for weeks, waiting for someone like you to arrive." Thomas explained that he had been living in Boston, working as a maritime engineer, when the first shipwreck occurred near Devil's Point. The Coast Guard investigation had mentioned the mysterious light signals, and Thomas realized someone was using his uncle's lighthouse for criminal purposes. "I came here to investigate myself," Thomas continued, "and discovered that someone had been maintaining Uncle Ezra's lighthouse, keeping it functional, but using it to wreck ships instead of save them. I've been trying to catch whoever it is for 3 weeks." Morrison studied Thomas carefully. Everything about his story rang true, but one crucial question remained. If you're trying to catch the real criminal, why are you dressed as your uncle and maintaining his records?
Thomas Whitmore's explanation was both ingenious and dangerous. He had realized that whoever was using the lighthouse expected Ezra Whitmore's ghost to be blamed for the wrecks. So Thomas had decided to become that ghost, maintaining the lighthouse and keeping Ezra's records to draw out the real criminal. "The real wrecker comes here every few days to check on the lighthouse and plan the next ship to target," Thomas explained. "They've been using Uncle Ezra's obsessive records to identify which vessels would be most profitable to wreck, ships carrying valuable cargo or wealthy passengers." Morrison was impressed by Thomas's detective work, but concerned about his methods. "You're putting yourself in incredible danger," he warned. "If this person is willing to wreck ships and kill innocent people, they won't hesitate to kill you." Thomas nodded grimly. "I know, but Uncle Ezra spent his entire life saving ships. I couldn't let someone use his lighthouse to destroy them. It would be..." He paused, searching for words. "It would be like desecrating his grave." But their conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both men freeze. A boat engine was approaching Devil's Point, and according to Thomas's copied logs, No vessels were scheduled to pass through this area tonight. "That's not a ship," Thomas whispered, peering through the beacon room window. "That's the wrecker. They must have seen your car in town and realized someone was investigating." Morrison could see a small motorboat approaching the rocky point below, its occupant moving with the confidence of someone very familiar with these dangerous waters. "We're about to meet our shipwrecker," Morrison said, checking his service revolver, "and judging by the fact that they're approaching at night during a rising storm, I'd say they're not coming here to talk."
Morrison and Thomas had the advantage of height and position, but their adversary had the advantage of desperation and intimate knowledge of Devil's Point. Through the beacon room windows, they watched as someone in a heavy rain slicker climbed the treacherous rocks with practiced ease. The lighthouse door burst open, and Morrison shouted his identification. "Police, come up slowly with your hands visible." But instead of compliance, they heard the sound of liquid being splashed around the lower level, followed by the unmistakable smell of gasoline. "They're going to burn the lighthouse with us inside," Thomas realized. Morrison quickly assessed their options. The beacon room had windows facing the ocean, but it was a 40-foot drop to jagged rocks. However, the lighthouse had one feature that might save them: the external maintenance ladder, used for cleaning the beacon lens. As smoke began rising through the lighthouse's central spiral, Morrison and Thomas climbed out onto the narrow maintenance platform. The storm was intensifying, with wind gusts that threatened to tear them from their precarious perch. But Morrison had spotted something crucial: a Coast Guard cutter approaching through the storm, drawn by the lighthouse beacon that Thomas had activated. The arsonist below had made a fatal error. In trying to destroy the evidence of their crimes, they had created the very signal that would bring help. The Coast Guard cutter's searchlight swept across Devil's Point, illuminating the burning lighthouse and the two men clinging to its side. The Coast Guard rescue was swift and professional. Morrison and Thomas were pulled to safety while the lighthouse burned behind them. But more importantly, they had captured the shipwrecker, Harbor Master Jonathan Cray, a respected member of the Beacons and community who had used his position to orchestrate the wrecks. Cray's confession revealed the full scope of his crimes. As Harbor Master, he knew which ships carried valuable cargo and could predict their routes past Devil's Point. He had been using EZRA Whitmore's abandoned lighthouse as a base for his wrecking operation, manipulating the beacon to guide ships onto the rocks during storms when rescue would be difficult. The 3 ships wrecked in the past month had netted Cray over $50,000 in salvaged cargo, a fortune in 1954. But his greed had led him to become careless, and Thomas Whitmore's impersonation of his uncle had finally drawn him into the open. Thomas Whitmore was cleared of any wrongdoing, his unorthodox investigation methods acknowledged as instrumental in solving the case. The lighthouse itself was too damaged by fire to be repaired, but Thomas arranged for a memorial plaque to be placed at the site, honoring his uncle's 18 years of faithful service. As Morrison prepared to return to Chicago, Thomas made an interesting observation. Uncle Ezra always said that a lighthouse keeper's job was to guide people safely home. In a strange way, he's still doing that. If he hadn't been so obsessed with keeping detailed records, we never would have caught Cray.
Morrison's drive back to Boston gave him time to reflect on the case. Devil's Point Lighthouse had indeed been tended by a ghost. Not the supernatural spirit of Ezra Whitmore, but the very real specter of greed that had possessed Jonathan Cray. The lighthouse keeper who never existed had, in a sense, solved his own case. Ezra Whitmore's obsessive record-keeping, maintained posthumously by his devoted nephew, had provided the evidence needed to convict his impersonator. But perhaps more importantly, the case had shown Morrison that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are those who hide behind respected positions in the community. Harbor Master Cray had used the town's trust to facilitate his crimes, betraying the very people he was sworn to protect. The ghost keeper of Devil's Point Light had finally found peace, not through supernatural intervention, but through the dedication of family love and the persistence of justice. Devil's Point would have a new lighthouse within the year, but the memory of Ezra Whitmore would forever stand as a reminder that some duties transcend even death. Because Detective Morrison had learned that in a world where respected citizens can harbor murderous secrets and where greed can corrupt even the most trusted positions, the real ghosts are often the living, those who betray their communities while hiding behind masks of respectability. Detective Morrison files will return, because there are always more mysteries hidden behind familiar faces, more crimes concealed by trusted positions, and more people who need someone to see through the fog of deception to find the truth.